Anatomy 32, Chapter 21, Special Senses, Topics Vision. So there are some accessory structures associated with our eyes, which are our structures for vision. There are eyelashes and eyebrows. These hairs are important to try to keep things from falling into the eye. And then there's, of course, the eyelids, also known as palpebrae. And the upper eyelid is actually raised and lowered partially by the muscle levator palpebrae superioris muscle, which is innervated by the oculomotor nerve. The eye also possesses lacrimal glands. A lacrimal gland produces lacrimal fluid, also known as tear fluid, which is mostly water with some mucus, salts, and lysozyme. Lysozyme being an antimicrobial compound. So the lacrimal glands produce the lacrimal fluid, the tear fluid, goes out the lacrimal ducts, goes around the surface of the eye, helping to keep the eye moist and clean. Then it'll eventually reach the lacrimal canals that lead to the lacrimal sac, then down through the nasolacrimal duct into the nasal cavity. So the tear fluid, the lacrimal fluid, will end up eventually entering the nasal cavity. And this is why when you cry, you get a runny nose. All right, the eyeball itself. The eyeball has 3 layers. The outermost layer is the fibrous tunic. The fibrous tunic has 2 big structures associated with it. You have the sclera. The sclera is the white portion of the eye, and this structure is very rigid and dense and provides a structural function, so it gives the eyeball its shape. And it also is an insertion site for muscles that can move the eye. And then anteriorly is another dense structure called the cornea. The cornea is transparent, and light can pass through the cornea, and when it passes through the cornea, it actually starts to get focused. Now, between the cornea and the lens of the eye is a cavity called the anterior cavity. And this anterior cavity is filled with a clear aqueous fluid that gets produced and reabsorbed. So it comes from the bloodstream, returns to the bloodstream. So sort of between the cornea and the sclera are some scleral venous sinuses. Again, sinus is a vein without smooth muscle tissue, and that is where that clear fluid returns to the bloodstream. It drains back into the scleral venous sinuses. So you can see that down here. It's produced, travels around the lens underneath the cornea, and then leaves back in the bloodstream via the scleral venous sinuses. The second layer of the eye is the vascular tunic, and as such, the vascular tunic has lots and lots of blood vessels. The bulk of the vascular tunic is composed of the choroid. The choroid is highly vascularized, lots of blood vessels, and also dark in color. Toward the anterior side of the vascular tunic is a structure called the cellular body. It is a ring of smooth muscle tissue that goes around the border of the eye. And these ciliary muscles in the ciliary body are able to control the tension on these zonular fibers. So there's these fibers that stretch from the ciliary muscles to the lens. And by muscular contractions, it can lead to the lens changing shape to focus light. And then ciliary processes are microscopic structures on the lens that help to attach the fibers to the lens directly. So ciliary body, ring of smooth muscle tissue, composed of ciliary muscles that control the tension on zonular fibers that connect to the lens via ciliary processes. And then the ciliary body is able to control the shape of the lens. Also part of the vascular tunic is another ring of smooth muscle tissue. This is anterior to the lens or in front of the lens, and this is called the iris. The iris is the colored part of the eye, as it were. So if someone says you have brown eyes, they're talking about the color of your iris. And in the center of the iris is a hole called the pupil. And light that passes through the cornea then must pass through the pupil to get deeper into the eye. And so the iris controls the amount of light that enters the eye by controlling the diameter of the pupil. The third layer of the eye is the retina. The retina, of course, being the innermost layer, has a pigment layer and a neural layer. The pigment layer helps to absorb excess light, and the neural layer is, of course, what will transmit the signal to the brain. Now, when you look at the retina, or the back of the eye, you can see an area that's really bright in color when the optometrist shoots the light into your eye, and that is the optic disc. The optic disc is where the optic nerve is forming in the eyeball, and the optic disc has no photoreceptors, has no receptors to detect light. So this is also called the blind spot. And so basically everyone has two little spots in their field of vision where they can't see anything, but the brain fills in that information so that you're not aware of it. So again, the pigment layer is made up of epithelial cells, and the epithelial tissue is dark in color and absorbs excess light, so that light does not bounce off of the retina back into the eyeball. And it is located between the choroid and the neural layer. The neural layer houses the photoreceptors, the rods and cones that are able to detect light. And as you can see, light must pass through the neural layer to get to the photoreceptors. You would expect the photoreceptors to be on the surface to get hit by light directly, but instead the light has to pass through the neural layer to get to the photoreceptors. There are two kinds of photoreceptors. There are the rods that are able to detect dim light and are unable to see any color. So rods work best in dim light, but only see in black and white. And the cones work best in bright light, and they are able to detect colors. So the cones give us the ability to see colors. Then there are the bipolar cells. The bipolar cells synapse with the rods and cones. So when a rod or cone is stimulated by by light, they will send a signal. They will synapse with the bipolar neural cells that will then carry the signal further out in the neural layer. So the bipolar cell layer is where you find the first order sensory neurons. Then you have the second order sensory neurons called the ganglion neural cells in the ganglion cell layer. And these neurons obviously synapse with the first order neurons with the bipolar neural cells. And then their axons that are carrying the signal form the optic nerve. So it is the second order sensory neurons that are forming the optic nerve that goes to the brain. And when you look at this whole neural layer, it's really weird because it's kind of backwards, because light has to pass through all these neurons before they're able to get to the actual photoreceptors, which makes the signal a little more diffuse. Also, because of this arrangement, we get the blind spot in the eye. It is an interesting arrangement. All right, also present in the retina is an area that's dark when you look at it, or when the eye doctor looks at it, and that is called the macula lutea. Macula lutea is the visual axis of the eye. It is directly across from the pupil, so it gets the best, most crisp visual inputs. And in the very center of the macula lutea is a depression called the fovea centralis, which only possesses cones. No rods, only cones. And again, this gives us the absolute best visual resolution right there in the center of our field of vision. The vitreous chamber is the posterior compartment of the eyeball, and it is filled with a gelatinous structure called the vitreous body that helps to hold the retina on the walls of the eyeball and also help to give the eyeball its overall shape. Here is the eye model. There's the cornea, the lens, the vitreous body, sclera in white, the optic nerve coming out the back. In intersection, cross section, here is where the blind spot would be because it's where the optic nerve would start. You have the darker color choroid layer, in this case orangish colored retina, and then of course this dark ring here is the cellular body. In an anterior view, again, we can see the sclera, the cornea, the iris, the colored portion, the pupil, the hole. There's the lacrimal gland. There's the superior rectus muscle, the inferior oblique muscle, lacrimal sac. All right, so the optic pathway. So again, the first order sensory neurons are those bipolar neural cells found in the retina, and they will synapse with the second order sensory neurons, or the ganglion neural cells. And then the second order sensory neurons are what sending out the nerve fibers that form the optic nerves. And then the optic nerves, right and left optic nerves, will meet up at a structure called the optic chiasm that is really close to the hypothalamus. And the medial fields of vision will switch sides. So the right medial field of vision will switch to the left side, and the left medial field of vision will switch to the right side. Then these nerves fibers will enter the brain and become the optic tract that leads to the thalamus. So again, optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tracts leading to the thalamus. There they will synapse with the third order sensory neurons that will then radiate out to the occipital lobe, where you find the primary visual areas. So again, optic nerve, optic chiasm, optic tract, where the thalamus would be, and the optic radiation leading to the primary visual area in the occipital lobe of the cerebral cortex. Blindness, or anopia, is a disorder for vision. Cataracts is when the person's lens loses its transparency. It becomes opaque over time. And so here's someone who's slowly going blind from cataracts. And the lens can be replaced with an artificial lens to restore the person's vision. There's glaucoma. Glaucoma is abnormally high intraocular pressure. So the fluid pressure in the eyeball gets to be too high, and that begins damaging the nerves of the retina. And this is actually the most common cause of blindness. And as you can see here, it usually causes a loss of the peripheral field of vision, and over time person will lose more and more of their vision. And then there's also age-related macular disease. This is a degenerative disorder where the retina and pigment layer starts to degrade, and usually starting in the macula lutea. And so that means the center of the person's field of vision is first disrupted, and then slowly over time it will spread out to eliminate their peripheral field of vision. That's it for this lecture.